The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today, we have a REMI special guest webinar to discuss the United States EV automotive outlook and considerations for an adjustment to the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, or the USMCA that replaced NAFTA. This webinar is being presented by Yan Chen, a North American automotive industry expert, with some additional REMI hypothetical scenarios for consideration, conducted by myself, Chris Judson, manager at REMI. Yan Chen worked as a principal economist at the Center for Automotive Research, where his work focused on economic fundamentals that influence automotive sales, production, and employment, as well as future trends in the United States automotive industry. Yan also worked as a legislative assistant for the Legislative Yuan, the legislative body of the Republic of China, be that Taiwan. We are always thrilled to work with Mr. Chen, and we are thankful that he took the time to conduct this webinar with us. At REMI, we provide dynamic economic models that decision makers use to project outcomes of policy decisions related to the fields of economic development: tax, transportation, energy, environmental, equity, and more. I think today's an interesting scenario of where we're talking about potential trade policy reform, new emerging industry clusters, workforce considerations, consumer trends. And so it's a fascinating topic area with lots of different variations and variables to consider for related types of analysis. If at any point during this presentation you have a question, we encourage you to enter the question into the questions window or box that you may see in the lower section of your GoToWebinar application. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please either let us know through the questions window, or you can contact us at info@remi.com. That's info@remi.com. We plan for this presentation to go for about 30 to 40 minutes in length, and then open it up to the floor to address questions from the audience. If we run out of time today, or you have any other additional support follow-up questions, again, please reach out to info@remi.com, and we will gladly connect you in with Yan, or respond accordingly. But yeah, thank you everyone for joining us today, and I think looks like we have a good amount of folks who've been able to connect in here. So with no further ado, Yan, I'll turn the floor over to you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, REMI, for inviting me for today's webinar. So my name is Yan Chen. I'm the senior economist in the automotive industry for more than 15 years, and I'm glad to be here to present my most recent research and share some my opinion and some of the outcomes. So please, next. So I will start with the most recent U.S. automotive industry update. And as you see here is the sales through June, and the overall the U.S. motor vehicle sales is up by 2.1% compared to the same period of time last year. And the light truck, which includes the SUV and the cross utilities, are up by 3.7%. And the passenger car is down by 4.0%. And overall, the market is at the 77.8 million units. And but however, the passenger cars only have 1.5 million units that consists of only 19.3% of the market share. Next. This is the monthly sales for the 2024 year to date. In June, we see the sales decline to 1.3 million units, down 3.4% from the same month last year. It also down 9% from May. The major reason is because of the U.S. Automotive dealership is suffering the cyber attack of the CDK, and they have the tremendous sales impact and the consumers the database impact. There many of the dealerships are unable to do the transaction in the past week, at the last week in June. And very fortunately, most of the dealership have resumed their regular operation after the 4th of July. And we are expecting the loss of the sales, which is some NADA, they're estimated about 4 to 5% of the sale has been lost. Those is the loss of the sale will be picked up in July. And next, yes. For the market share, you see here, we have a Detroit 3 company, including General Motors and Stellantis and Ford. General Motors have their market share declined to 16.4% from 16.8% last year. However, General Motors is still holding the top position in the U.S. motor vehicle market. For the Japanese automakers, including Toyota, Honda, and the Nissan, they all have a market share gain combined with 2.2 percentage point. Toyota have almost 1.6% market share percentage point increase. Honda have increased by 0.5%. Even Nissan has a slight increase in the market share from last year. Stellantis, however, is among the Detroit 3, suffered the largest loss from last year's 10.4% down to 8.6% through June of 2024. Next. Talking about the electric vehicle sales as of year to date, if we're looking at all of the powertrain technology, the total EVs is still up by 19.3% compared to the overall light vehicle market of a 2.1% growth. However, if we're looking to each of the different technology, pure electric, which is a battery electric vehicle, actually declined by 0.2% compared to the same period of time last year. The growth in the EV segment there actually came from two segments, which is a hybrid vehicle and a plug-in hybrid. Traditional hybrid is up by 35.6%, and the plug-in hybrid is also up by near 36%. Despite the BEV have the decline by 0.2%, however, ICE internal combustion engine segment actually declined even higher at the 1.1% in terms of the sale. So overall, the EV, including battery electric vehicle, is still outperforming the internal combustion engine this year. Next. This is the market share that we're looking into all the EV. You can see here the battery electric vehicles now holding 6.9% of the total US market share. It slightly declined from 7.2% market share from the end of the last year. The traditional hybrid vehicle gained a significant market share from 7.6% at the end of 2023 to 9.1% in June of 2024. The plug-in hybrids also have a significant increase in the market share, up to 2.2% market share right now. Next. And this is a production, the North American production. And for the North American production, is actually performed better than the U.S. sales. Overall, the production is up by 4.9% through May of 2024. You can see here almost all of major automaker had a significant production growth. except for Hyundai, Kia, and the Stellantis. Stellantis, particularly, they suffer 18.9% of the production loss is due to the two plants that have been closed. The one is Belvedere plant in Illinois, and also in the Brenton plant in Canada. They're both Belvedere plant now is being in the process of converted into the warehouses now. Stellantis, they promised in their previous UAW contract, they promised to have the new EV plant in the nearby location. However, that promise is that we won't see the new plan to come out until 2027 or later. And for the Canadians, the Brampton plant is now down for the retooling for the new EV and the plug-in hybrid vehicle. And the production won't be available, won't start until end of 2025 or beginning of 2026. So we still have about a year and a half to 2 years before we can see the Brampton plant come back on to the production. Next. This is the monthly production in North America. We can see here we have consistently 1.5 million units of production so far this year. And despite the slightly slowing down in the sales this month, if we were be able to keep the production constant at the 1.5 million, at the end of the year, we will be able to see the North American vehicle production to reaching close to the 18 million unit. That 18 million unit have not been reached since 2018, almost 6 years ago. We haven't had that same number of the production in 6 years. And we're eager to see if the North American motor vehicle production can reach 18 million units again. Next. And then we start with looking at the economic outlook. Next. So this is the World Bank's global outlook that just releases last month. They're expecting the world real GDP will be 2.6% growth. Then in the next 2 years will be hovering around 2.7%. In the United States, they're expecting this year will be the same as what we had in 2023. It's about 2.5%. However, the World Bank anticipated we were going to have a slower real GDP growth in the next 2 years, giving the likelihood that we're not going to have a strong government expenditure that we had in the past 4 years. For a European area, they're expecting to have an improvement, including this year and the next 2 years to the highest 1.4% next year of the real GDP growth. And for the Japan, there's anticipated a somewhat slower GDP growth this year, and also hovering around 1.0% of the GDP growth in Japan. For China and India, they're anticipated both of the country will have a slower GDP growth. China is down to 4.8% this year, and around 4.0% in the next 2 years. For India, the GDP anticipated for 6.6% growth this year, and hovering around 6.7 and 6.8 in the next 2 years. And they both have the lower GDP growth compared to the 2023 level. So next. And one of the major reasons that we're looking at the real GDP is because it's highly tied to, especially the US GDP growth is tied to the US motor vehicle sales. So this is chart that we show lining up the sales growth versus and line up with the US GDP growth. You can see here the vehicle growth. If we want to line the number with 2% of the real GDP growth, you see the US light duty vehicle sales going hand in hand with US GDP. Those two in the series, and they have the very good correlation until the 2010, And in the past decade or so, those two numbers does not seem to be coordinated to each other anymore, especially from the 2010 to 2016. And we have a robust light duty vehicle sales growth, but we have a sluggish GDP growth in 2010 through 2016. And from 2016 to 2020, we have a significant GDP growth. However, we have a sluggish sales. And since the pandemic, since 2020, the correlation seems to return now. So we have for the Q1 of the 2024, we have somewhat sluggish 1.3, 1.4% of the real GDP. And we have roughly around 5% of the sales growth right now. And if we are anticipated 2.5% real GDP growth this year, we're going to see a significant motor vehicle growth, sales growth as well in 2024. Next. Then let's talk about the hottest topic in the economics. That is how or when the Federal Reserve is going to cut the interest rate. There are two major indicators that the Federal Reserve is looking at. Of course, one is inflation, the other is the labor market. And this is number showing the two type of the price inflation there in the economics. So one is the dark blue one is the CPI, consumer price. The dark blue is a consumer CPI, consumer price index that calculates all items. The other one is called the PCE, price inflation, which is personal consumption expenditure. That is Federal Reserve looking at it right now. So you can see those two numbers seem to correlate to each other. However, during the high inflation period, they are somewhat detached to each other. One of the major reason for both series, they calculated differently. The major differences that lies on the personal consumption expenditure has a substitute effect, which means if the one item or one product has a higher price, higher inflation, then the consumers will start reducing the consumption of those and to purchase as an alternative. And the substitute effect will lower the PCE price inflation because it calculated the quantity as well. For the CPI, it does not take the quantity into the calculation. It only calculate the bucket of the item and they have the different weight on each of the item, regardless of in the real world how the consumer purchased it. So that's why the PCE price inflation tend to have a lower percentage versus the CPI, and because of the substitute effect. When those two numbers are starting to line up to each other, that indication that the consumers already get used to the current price level, and the substitute effect is no longer there. And in May of 2024, which is the number that the last numbers being shown, we have the 3.3% of the CPI inflation and the 2.6% of a PCE. The difference is still there. However, the number is closing into each other. So this is the one indicator that the Federal Reserve is looking at it. They may not be satisfied with those numbers yet, so that's why they're delaying their decision for the federal funds rate to the second half of the year. However, the one concern that I have here is the labor market, which is showing in the next slide. So this is the labor market here. So the chart that I'm showing you here is job vacancy per employees here, which is that's showing up in the light blue bar here. The dark line here is the federal funds target rate, which is on the upper limit. You can see here the job vacancy per employees, or you can say the job vacancy per job seeker is now down to 1.2 jobs, and that's down significantly from the 2022, which is as high as 2 job vacancy per job seekers. And 1.2 is actually the same level as pre-pandemic in the back to 2019, when the Federal Reserve starting to cut their interest rate back in 2019. And this is an indicator means we have a very tightening. We are tightening the labor market right now, because we have what the lower the job vacancy per job seeker is an indicator that we don't have enough of a job vacancy available for the job seekers, and so we have lower job opening, and we have a higher number of the people who are looking for a job, and those number is the indicator that as a 1.2 jobs per job seeker, it could be the indicator that the Federal Reserve started to consider this is a time to cut the interest rate before it's been too late, and before the high interest rate start to hurt the economy. So I understand most of the economists were predicting the first time the Fed to cut the interest rate would be in September. However, due to the tightening in the labor market, and as well as the inflation rate starting to coming down, it's not surprising if the Federal Reserve to cut the interest rate at the end of July, which is before, because if they don't do the decision at the end of July, then they don't have the meeting in August. Then the next time they're going to meet again will be in September. So keep an eye open. Next. This is the federal funds rate target that been determined in the last meeting, which is in June. In 2024, you see here the midpoint is 5.18. This is the consensus at the midpoint, and also the range is very low, very narrow. It's only hovering about 4.8% to the 5.2%. So they are zero in the target for 2024, and it's probably only have one of the interest rate cut before the end of the year. However, in 2025 and 2026, you can see here, although the midpoint for the federal funds rate target is at the 4 and 1/8 and 3 and 1/8 in the next 2 years, but the ranges are pretty wide. So that tells me that in the federal open market committees, they still don't have a consensus of how high or how fast the interest rate should be cut or should be reduced in the next 2 years. So everything is still up in the air at the moment. At least in 2024, we are pretty confident they're not going to cut the interest rate very fast, and in the next 2 years, it can be very slow, or it can be in a moderate reduction in the interest rate. Next. Okay, so let's go to the EV market and what is the implication of the most recent policy that have an impact on the US EV. So I'll focusing on the 30D clean vehicle credit focus, and just talk about it a little bit deeper into the foreign entity of concern and the battery component requirement and the critical mineral requirement, because of those three requirements being have the Department of Treasury released it in May of the final piece of the guidance. They gave us a more clearness in how to determine the 30D clean vehicle credit and how to comply with it. Next. So before we talk about the battery component and critical mineral, I just give it a overall outlook, overall review of what the clean vehicle credit is and what is the differences and what is the major requirement. So the major requirement for the 30D clean vehicle credit that versus the previous EV incentive is they have two primary requirement. One is MSRP. So on the right hand side, the vehicle has to be low. Their MSRP cap cannot be over 80 if it's a van, SUV, or truck, or if it's a passenger car. The MSRP cannot be more than 55 if you want to apply for the clean vehicle credit. On top of the MSRP, they also require the battery component and the critical mineral to be localized. So in 2024, the battery component localization has to be 60% or higher. If you don't have the battery component to be made in North America, then over 60% of your value, then you lost half of the incentive. If your end of the critical mineral in 2024, the requirement is a 50% need to be processed in North America or in the free trade agreement countries. If you don't have the critical mineral to be localized in those countries, then you lost another half. And in addition to that, they have the foreign entity of a concern starting in 2024 on the battery component, and for a foreign entity concern on the critical mineral will kick in the beginning of 2025, with January 2025. For the next 2 years, for the next 2 years, they will have a grace period, two years window called the impracticable to trace battery material exclusion, which means there's certain type of the material will be excluded from the calculation of the localization, and also will be excluded from the foreign entity of concern compliances. And I'll talk about the impracticable to trace battery material a little bit deeper in the next few slides. Next, yep. This is the EV sales so far in the United States. We can see here for all, there are only 52% of the EV that currently sold in the United States qualify for 30D clean vehicle credit because of all of the requirements they've been put on to the incentives. And those 52%, you see here, majority of those EV qualification fall into the Tesla's models. For the Model 3, it's a little bit different because only the standard version of a Model 3 would qualify for the 30D. For the extended range or performance Model 3, it's not qualified for this. Does not qualify for the 30D. And also in terms, in terms of the models, it's only 22 models among all of the 99 EVs that currently sold in the US market qualify for 30D tax credit because of all the restriction in the battery component and the critical mineral and the MSRP. And however, keep in mind that they also have a 45W, which is a commercial clean vehicle credit. The commercial clean vehicle credit that can apply to any of the electric vehicle and the plug-in hybrid vehicle that you are showing here. Though they don't have any restriction on MSRP or the battery component or critical minerals. So that's why you can see a lot of the non-qualifying EV that's showing here. They're using the commercial credit to gain that $7,500 through leasing or through the rental. Next. Foreign entity of concern, that I just mentioned earlier, is this is a official definition of the foreign entity of concern. However, we all know is only matter in the middle here. There's a item C is owned by, controlled by, or subject to the jurisdiction, direction of a government of the foreign country that is covered in the covered nation, which is China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. In terms of automotive vehicle, automotive and the motor vehicle in perspective is really a China that we're talking about here. Next. Foreign entity is not that, it's more than just the central government of China. It's actually a government of a foreign country, including including the local government as well, and even the political figures that will come into the foreign entity as well. And also, is if you're a non-U.S. citizen or the non-permanent resident in those covered nation, it would be the foreign entity of concern as well. Or a U.S. entity or U.S. company, you run the business in the covered nation, you will be considered as a foreign entity of a concern as well. And there's another item here as being a significant or major concern here, how to avoid being the foreign entity of a concern is owned by, controlled by, or subject to the direction. You have to limit the combined 25% or lower of the board seat voting right or equity interest to be not considered as a foreign entity of concern. This is a very harsh, very narrowly defined regulation. So many of the company would have to avoid that, the foreign entity concern, before they can use it for the battery component or critical mineral in the U.S. motor EV in order to be qualified. Next. And for the battery component, is also the definition is it has to be manufactured or assembled from the component or battery material. And also the battery component is not every battery component has been defined in this category. Only the component that actually produce or store the electricity. So for example, like the cathode, anode, and co-separator, electrolyte, and the battery cell, battery module will be considered the battery component. Beyond those, like the housing, heat management, the thermal management, those are not considered as a battery component. And those components, although that's being installed in as a part of the battery pack, those can be made in anywhere in the world. Next. For battery material, the differences between material and the component in the regulation, in the policy, is material has to be processed, has to through processing, the process, and not through manufacturing or through assemble. So extraction, process, or recycle of the material will be called the battery material instead of the battery component. Process means you can heat treat it, you can purify it, or you can mix. Those are called the through processing, and the product of those process will be treated as a material instead of a component. And there's at least 3 categories of the critical minerals. Those critical category will be determined, and used through those category be calculating how what is the localization percentage will be used here. Next. Impracticable to trace battery material. This is the new definition that come out in May. It's a applicable critical mineral that following in those circumstances. One is a graphite containing in anode materials. Those are being given the two years window to make it locally, and also the applicable critical mineral that contain in electrolyte salt, binders, and the additive will become as impregnable to trace material as well, because of those critical mineral, there's many of the rare earths, and you cannot get it anywhere else except from China. So those rare earths, the U.S. company and the U.S. electric vehicle and a battery, they're given the 2-year window to get the rare earths and the critical mineral in the United States, in North America, or in the free trade countries. So those two years window is very important for the automotive maker and the battery manufacturer that who wish to produce the battery in the United States and they want their product to be qualified for the 30D clean vehicle credits. Next. So this is the chart been showing here in the critical mineral requirement. We see here starting in 2025, the localization has to be reached 60% if you want to qualify for 30D. And also for an entity of concern would apply starting in 2025, January 1st. And in addition, those will impracticable to trace material will be given 2 years window, a grace period, before those rare earths can be made in North America or in the free trade countries. Next. And for the international trade, and this is the chart when showing here of import of the lithium battery. And on the left-hand side is the lithium battery for all the electric vehicles. On the right-hand side is the import of the non-EV lithium batteries. You can see here China dominate the both category in 2023. Next. You can see here import of the lithium-ion battery for EV, China 65% of the total, the currently imported. On the next, the imported of the Chinese non-EV lithium battery is account for almost 72% of the total that we imported. So which means is we still relying heavily of imported lithium-ion battery from China in 2023, despite those two, despite the Biden administration, they put the new Section 301 tariff against the Chinese import on the EV will be 25% of the tariff, and starting August 1st, for the non-EV battery, lithium-ion battery, the 25% will start in 2026. And we will see how the new tariff being putting in and how does it affect the battery import around the world. Next. So giving the requirement and the battery component, critical mineral imports, and for an entity of a concern, how does that affect the U.S. electric vehicle market share projection? So last year, the EPA have the proposed rules. They anticipated by 2032, those numbers will be reached by 68, or they anticipate 68% of the new light-duty vehicle will be electric vehicle. However, in this year, the final rules put out by EPA, they anticipated the battery electric vehicle to be 56%. They're given a 13% grace period, or the grace 13% of the market share be given to the plug-in hybrid. So it's not that the EPA they giving up the 68% of the market share. It's just because the last year 68% of the market share they didn't consider a plug-in hybrid could be there, and for the final rule they gave the 13% to the plug-in hybrid, and still anticipated 56% by 2032 to be battery electric vehicle. And for the estimated the actual sales with the IRA, This is a number I retrieved from the industry global data there, and their forecast. They are forecasting the 45% of the fab by 2032. It's somewhat a little bit lower than the EPA's ruling. And however, if we don't have a successful IRA incentive to the electric vehicles, we might be end up with only 20% of the market share by 2032. As you might have seen it right now, we actually have somewhat slowing down. Actually, we have a slightly decline in the market share in the battery electric vehicles this year. So it might be a pretty tough time trying to reach any of those market share by 2032. They lay out by the EPA or by the market for the industry consensus, which is 45% by 2032, because we only have 8 years left, and we want to reach any of those from current is only about 7.0% of market share to over 20% is a challenge, let alone to be 45% or higher. So that's why the incentive in the U.S. EV is so important, and also this is also an indicator that it's still a wild guess for the U.S. BEV share projection in the next 8 years, because really there's a lot of possibility it could happen in the next 8 years. So for that, I will give it back to Chris.
Thank you.
Chris?
Yeah, fantastic presentation. I think that's a nice segue for our next area of discussion, looking at some of the economic impacts of related scenarios. And again, we welcome folks to submit any questions, but we'll dive into those questions after the adjournment of this next brief discussion. So there has been some work with REMI done on this topic by several different clients. One good example study, and this was kind of in line with the IRA projections, but the idea here was in their impact analysis to look at the increase of electric vehicle battery production and select related components in America. What would be the impacts potentially in 2030 and 2040, assuming there was sort of status quo, no increase in foreign competition relative to when the study was commissioned last year, and supporting government policy to help with permitting and jobs training, which is certainly a growing area of concern. We see that with gaps, particularly in electricians for EV charging stations and related infrastructure. So it's going to be an interesting time ahead. And so what their projections were in this particular analysis, they included EV battery recycling assumptions, EV production decreases in ICE vehicle or internal combustion engine vehicle production decreases, right? Because the idea was they were assuming you have your projections for motor vehicle sales, but then a portion of that would shift from ICE to EVs, which would also include its supporting infrastructure, so including potentially increases in domestic EV battery production and metal and mineral production. At this time, the study did not include additional investments required in charging infrastructure, changes in electricity sales. I know that's a challenge, both the electrification of the grid and emergence of the AI data centers. There's going to be significant demands, projected demands on current electric grid infrastructure that would have to go hand in hand to support the interest in adoption or switch to EVs. And then that goes side by side, right? So electricity sales would go up, but then there could also be some other adjustments for decreases in in gas and diesel and other potential vehicle maintenance repair. And so with that being said, this reflects these related assumptions. So they would essentially go in and modify the simulation. We created some custom industries and based on surveys and data available to create an industry for the EV manufacturing and batteries. There's some potential considerations for mining, but for now, it's relatively, the assumptions were relatively limited. But nevertheless, this is the net impact, right? So we're accounting for that shift from ICE to electric vehicles. And we believe that the net impact could exceed, without being clipped by other constraints, 350,000 jobs in 2030 and upwards of 570,000 jobs in 2040 for the moderate scenario. And more of a high growth scenario that'd be more indicative of one of Yen's previous projections. I think looking at the final EPA rule, could witness, significant increases there as well. And again, this is over multiple years. Numbers are in fixed 2020 dollars, but we could be talking, over 500,000 jobs created on average over this time period, with significant increases in competition, GDP, and output. So it's an interesting arena. It's certainly a different supply chain than conventional ICE, and I think that's the real part of the challenge there is we see states are all competing for the next EV manufacturing plant or battery plant, but can't necessarily rest on your laurels. Although some states do have a competitive advantage for ICE vehicles, and there is some transition over, and Yan can tell you more about that. The competitive advantages for making EVs, but it's not necessarily the same. And in many cases, it's different, and so it really causes states to kind of rethink, what do they need to be competitive in this space, and nations. And so what we're trying to spark some conversation and talk about today is when we're looking at these potential policy variable considerations, we can model changes in tariffs or subsidies or other interventions, as Jen discussed, with the foreign entity of concern and adjustments to USMCA. We'll get into two hypothetical scenarios in a moment. And then there is going to be this to kind of mitigate some of those negative effects from that shift away towards ICE potentially, that retraining program and of displaced workers, but also to meet the demands of the new labor force needed so we can be competitive and provide these jobs. And so I'll go back and forth a bit, but this is a study we did with the Upshot Institute and Summit Consulting with the Manufacturing Economic Partnership at the National Institute of Science and Technology. And they've run this for almost several years in a row. But it's interesting that these workforce training programs can have tremendous returns on investment. This at the federal level. They run it a few different ways, and they can also account for cannibalization or crowding out of other potential entities if they didn't receive that training, but others did. But to show by filling in, this is the potential if we can fill these mid-skill gaps that are needed, which could attribute to over 300,000 more jobs, and just for a $175 million investment. So you can see really tremendous potential returns for years to follow. But it's one of those programs that it's not a one and done. It's one of those ongoing, constantly being retrained in new technologies, manufacturing processes, and the types of things that are being produced. And so it's that critical step that it's not just maybe trying to attract them to begin with, but considering the constant innovation that this industry is going through, and in many ways is growing at a faster rate than a lot of other highly capital intensive industries that we've seen before, almost similar to chips manufacturing, just tremendous leaps and bounds that are being occurred, and it's a competitive landscape. So I mentioned briefly that that's always a concern, is will we have that applicable EV charging infrastructure, and you can model that separately, and today we didn't necessarily look at that. This whole discussion over rare earth minerals, there's always new potential opportunities being explored, but I think a lot of that remains to be seen, where if the U.S. will open up in a meaningful way, or maybe partner with other nations for sourcing those rare earth minerals. And as Jan mentioned, there's several different technologies for different types of batteries, and pros and cons to them, and that continues to evolve. But I think ultimately it's that need for that collaborative effort, between regional, state, national governments, maybe multi-state, rather than winner take all, figuring out how the states can work together. So we remain an active part in this growing industry. So what we get into in these next sets of scenarios is kind of that benefit cost, right? And the related challenges is that, well, the benefit is that you could have this emergence of cheap electric vehicles, maybe a continued dominance or growth of maybe cheap electric batteries from China. But then, so that could be good for maybe the direct consumer, but then there's also risks, from the macroeconomic side, losing that industrial capacity, but also, it could be significant shifts into the future for the U.S. automotive manufacturing sector. And so some of the scenarios we're going to briefly cover today is looking at, well, what if we were to increase foreign import costs, and then as is, and see what that means for competitiveness of American industries. And then the other one would be, okay, well, what if we increase foreign import costs, but we assume like an equal rebate? That rebate could be considered to be a form of a tariff or some type of tax revenues, associated with the economic activity. There's, as Jan was indicating, there's a lot of variations that could occur in the near term. And so for the purpose of the simulations today, it's to kind of give you a directional potential understanding and just some considerations for how these types of issues can be modeled. But again, we're happy to have a call at a later time to discuss more, specifics relevant to precise scenarios. So in this one scenario, we went into REMI and we increased the foreign import costs. We've done this before with our clients for tariffs, but this could also be looked at as a relative sense. So one way in which we could say is, okay, we're going to mark China as a foreign entity of concern and prohibit the sale of, let's say, the Chinese electric vehicles in North America, potentially. You could also look at it as, okay, well, if we did that, then maybe we'll lose this number of direct jobs, but there is some implied pricing and other effects included. And so what this variable will do is on net, it would show, okay, relatively speaking, in a world that we could have had access to maybe cheap EVs, but now we no longer have access to these cheap EVs without any other benefits, just kind of isolating that one scenario. That in and of itself could lead towards a significant decrease in jobs. Now, in percentage terms, in this hypothetical scenario, it's I mean, you could say it's 0.5%, 1%. I mean, that is, fairly significant. With losses in GDP and output and personal income, but then it is interesting. So if we look at this by like industry, there can be winners and losers to these policy regulations. So in this scenario, we're looking at impacts on more as a proxy, more of the traditional motor vehicle parts manufacturing and vehicle manufacturing. So they benefit in some of their key, supply chain. So there are, and in reality, there would probably be some industries that might be relatively automotive intensive that would benefit. I could break that out in a moment, but in some industries like New England, we don't really have a whole lot, and some to deal with the automobile supply chain, but fairly limited. That would probably be relatively worse off. You're stuck with higher prices, and we're not getting a significant share likely of those jobs. And then we have another scenario of, okay, well, let's say if it is a little bit more like a tariff or kind of as a proxy for the other taxes that could be generated from all this additional economic activity that, potentially wouldn't have taken place if we had these cheap foreign imports to contend with. And so we did a foreign import cost, same variables before, and dollar for dollar, converted it to the dollar equivalent, and said, okay, 50% will go to a form of a reduction in production costs. So that could be, for fleet vehicles that are, leased or purchased. And then we also looked at 50% as like a reduction in the consumer price for new automotive vehicles. Of course, there's other variables that can be considered, but, for the purposes of today's discussion. And so in this case, interesting enough, it actually goes positive. If we were able to assume that we're able to somehow, recap that, right? I mean, a tariff, you could argue it does go to the U.S. Treasury, but you could say maybe in order to fund, parts of the Inflation Reduction Act and in supporting the EV program, you could utilize those tariffs in a way to kind of make it maybe a revenue neutral policy. And in that case, we could witness net positive impacts. A bit more on the margin, but still, maybe positive. And again, the specific numbers I wouldn't focus on as much as the directional effects. But in this scenario, we could be looking at as much as a 0.25% or 0.5% increase in employment and related GDP growth. And so now you still get the motor vehicle parts manufacturing. A lot of this has to do with the induced effects and because businesses are receiving rebates. And so you're ticking up on a lot of these other types of industries that would otherwise not have benefited. Now, there are some industries that may still be in net, right? So, for example, this is a bit of a unique one, but let's say personal care services, some of these other particularly consumer consumption categories that in some cases other things have gone up in cost, and so maybe they're spend less on some of these other categories, but they're moved forward with acquiring that EV and then they received a rebate. So there's always still a potential consideration for winners and losers, but on net it could turn a potentially net negative effect on the economy to a net positive. And so there's always policy variable considerations to be made that I think a place to start could be, okay, well, here's the industry footprint of the EV industry currently, and then maybe projections in the future. But then you can get into doing these other price cost rebate adjustments to fine tune it for other considerations. And I'll say it's been a tremendous pleasure working with Rien for many years, and we continue our collaborative relationship. He's certainly one of the leading industry experts doing automotive industry related, macroeconomic and other policy assessments. So with that being said, I'm just going to turn it back over to the slide deck. I think we are in our QA section. Any questions from the audience? Let's go ahead and take a look. Brian, do you want to read off a few, or do you want me to jump into it?
Yeah, I was keeping track, so I can go ahead and ask a question. We are just about out of time, so I think maybe we'll do about a question or two, depending on how fast it is, and then the rest we'll reach out to you personally. But this one, yeah, and I think it would be good for you. I'd like to
Mhm.
hear a little bit more about the segments and links of the automaker supply chain most impacted by the cyber attacks that you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. What was the main target of the cyber attacks? Was it a specific country, specific automakers? Thank you.
Okay, so the cyber attack, my understanding is not related to any of the segment specific. It's just that the company is called the CDK. They're running the dealership management system. It's a backend system. They're managing their customer and their connection with financial account and their capability to look up the inventory, to look up the pricing, and be able to give the quote to the customer. It's mainly is affecting to the retail side. And my understanding is 15,000 dealers has been affected. They are unable to access to their database, and the render that many of them is unable to sell the vehicle or given a quote to the person that who want to buy the vehicle because they are unable to check their credibility, check their financial score, or even given a proper discount if they want to. And that's why it's not a direct connection to any of the specific model or dealers or company automakers. It's a nationwide, system-wide cyber attack. And my understanding is the CDK they gave a ransom, and the cyber attack, the hacker. I believe they say they're starting to restore the system on the week of the 4th of July last week, and my understanding is not every dealers has restored it completely, but they're expecting the system to be resumed back to normal as soon as this week.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you very much for that thoughtful response, Ian.
Yeah. I feel that it's they say the hacker asking for like tens of a million as a ransom. I was surprised they didn't give it those ransom right away because compared to the size of the U.S. motor vehicle market, the new vehicle market alone is 700 billion. 700 billions of market a year. They're only asking for tens of a million as a ransom. I don't understand why they hold up for a couple days before they run into the snowball and affecting everyone. I'm just speechless.
Could you speak to regarding foreign competition, the BYD building in Mexico, and how that could impact U.S. production timeframes?
The BYD production in Mexico, because of the new Section 301 tariff, and even the BYD they're making their vehicle in Mexico. My understanding is they haven't actually built any vehicle in Mexico. They have investment there. They say they are not interested yet to sell their vehicle in the United States. But keeping in mind, Mexico is a great country as a base to export to anywhere in the world. They have a free trade agreement with Europe, have a free trade agreement with South America, and they have a free trade agreement with many of the Asian countries as well because they are part of the CPTPP. So it makes perfect sense to build the vehicle there, not even though they are not targeting for the U.S. as their market. Keep in mind, Mexico and Canada has a CPTPP, so their vehicle made in Mexico can send it to Canada zero tariff. So I think the BYD, they're targeted in the production in Mexico, at least for now, not for the U.S. market. And but rather than the U.S. market, they're going for the Canada, South America, and the Europe.
And then, Ian, if China were listed as a foreign entity of concern for EV and EV parts manufacturing, what could that potentially apply to production in Canada, Mexico, and US, or that's to be determined?
Well, the USMCA is going to have a 5-year review beginning next year, 2025. And my understanding is they're going to have another round or another negotiation of the new USMCA. So they're going to have the new regulation. My understanding is they're specifically for the Chinese investment in Mexico. So we can right now the USMCA is good through the 2025, and then we will have another round of the new USMCA. And so yeah, it's a concern, and it definitely is a concern. But right now, so because everything is still up in the air, we don't know what exactly that will have an impact to the U.S. EV production and the sales.
Okay, well, terrific. I think we are a bit over time today, but we will certainly follow up with any other questions folks have. Yen, thank you very much for this insightful presentation. A copy of the recording and the slides should be made available on our website within a few business days. Everyone should receive likely a follow-up email with links. But yeah, please feel free to reach out, and we'll certainly happily keep everyone posted with exciting developments in this space. And yeah, we hope everyone has a terrific week ahead. Yen, do you have any closing remarks?
All right. Thank you, Chris.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Have a terrific afternoon.